Well, hello all, and welcome to this Azure Arc Ask the Expert session. My name is Guillermo Gomez, and I'm going to be your moderator today. And I'm here with some of my teammates from the Azure Arc team. So today we want to make sure that we answer as many questions as we can. So the way this works is if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. We will make sure that the chat moderators publish them, so you will be able to see other questions when they are published. And it will be very helpful if you use the upvote feature to help us triage through the questions that you are most interested on. Experts will answer the questions verbally. We have here some of us that will be on camera, and some of the questions may be answered on the chat. We also want to make sure that you understand that this is a recorded session. And feel free to, I want to make sure that you also know that you need to adhere to the Microsoft Code of Conduct. And with that said, let me introduce you to the team that is here with us today. As I said, my name is Guillermo Gomez, and I'm a product manager in the Arc team. I'm here with Ryan Puffer. He is the Azure Arc Enabled Servers expert. We have Jason Hansen, who is the Azure Arc Enabled Kubernetes expert. We have Tolga Telkin as well, Azure Arc Enabled Data Services expert. That is coming with Brian De Souza, which is the product manager for Arc Enabled Data Services. And we have Nir Bensby, which is the PM lead for the Arc product. And with that said, feel free to start sharing your questions here on the chat. All right, so before we get questions, as they may be going through some of them, Ryan or Nir, one of you, why don't you talk a little bit about what are the top use cases for Azure Arc Enabled Servers?
Sure, thanks, Guillermo. So we've had a lot of customers use Arc Enabled Servers during the private and public preview phases, and we saw kind of three top trends across all these customers. So the first one was using Arc Enabled Servers to kind of get a view of all their assets no matter where they're running. So sort of an inventory scenario where you got some stuff running on-prem, maybe in other clouds. You want to have it all show up in Azure so that you can start to see all the different machines you have in one place. You can use tags in Azure to go and organize them and query on those at a later point in time. And it really kind of starts to bring everything into one place. Second is to use governance through Azure Policy on these Arc-enabled servers. So with Arc-enabled servers, we are extending Azure Policy to your on-premises machines. That allows you to start auditing OS and software settings on those machines. And you'll get those results again all in one spot in Azure. So if you have Azure VMs as well, it will consolidate the results and give you one place to look to see how you're doing for your security or other compliance needs that you may have deployed through Azure Policy. The last one we often saw was the use of extensions. And extensions enable you to quickly and easily deploy monitoring agents or scripts to your on-premises machines directly from Azure. So instead of having to go and use some other tool to go and push down your agents and onboard them to other Azure services, you can use Azure Policy or ARM templates, command line tools, whatever your choice of tool might be, to go and deploy these pieces of software at scale right from the Azure portal. So you can do that wherever you happen to have access to Azure instead of needing to be right next to those servers or through some other orchestration tool. So those are the three top use cases we saw for Arc-enabled servers.
Awesome. So we have a question here from the chat. Are there any plans to make Azure Arc for servers cluster aware so that changes through Arc don't apply to all nodes in a cluster at the same time? I'm guessing that this is, if we are talking about clusters, is more for Jason, correct?
I think this one would actually be me. So I think this is talking about failover cluster. Please reply to your comment if that's not what we're talking about. But failover cluster today, a lot of actions you want to have the same result happen across all those machines. Arc-enabled servers is an individual server management tool. So you're going to onboard each of those cluster nodes independently. And you can choose to put them in the same resource group or use tags to make sure that you know which ones are related to the same cluster, but we don't have native support for enforcing that the 3 or whatever nodes you have in that cluster get the same configuration, at least not today.
Awesome. We have one question for Jason. Do we have any Cookbook references, documents to tie in external Kubernetes clusters? He understands that the concept of Arc, however, he's having trouble finding a copy-paste type of reference to enable this connectivity.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we do have a repository that has a number of quick start sort of recipes that allow you to get started to quickly and easily provision a Kubernetes cluster, onboard it to Azure Arc, and then start walking through some of the scenarios that we have in our private or in our public preview. That includes pushing GitOps-based configurations to your clusters, as well as deploying some of those Azure integrated services that we have, which includes things like Azure Policy for Kubernetes, as well as Azure Monitor for containers. And I'll go ahead and paste the link to that repository. We call it the Azure Arc Jumpstart repo, so you might be able to get some search juice there. I'll paste that into chat, and that should be a good place to get you started. As well, we also have our documentation for Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, and that's been refreshed as part of our Ignite launch as well.
Awesome. Yeah, that Jumpstart repository is great. One question for Nir. Are there plans to integrate Azure Arc for servers with Azure Stack Hub so that VMs deployed to Hub can be onboarded directly into Arc as well as for management through Arc? All right.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah. All right. Sorry about it. The Azure Stack Hub VMs are already Azure VMs. They're using the same technology exactly as Azure. So they have all, they have or they will soon have all the capabilities that Azure VMs have. And that's how you should think about these. When you talk about other Azure Stack products like Azure Stack HCI, that's where we will Arc enable the virtual machines running on Azure Stack HCI so that you have the same experience as if they're running in Azure.
Makes sense. And there is another question for you. For server connectivity, what is the roadmap for additional management actions on external hosts that are connected with Arc? Last time this person checked, Arc showed external connectivity. However, you couldn't really do much.
Yeah, so this is a Ryan question, but I'm happy to have it. You know, we actually, one thing that I wanted to call out is that with this public preview that we're going, sorry, with this GA, we've been in public preview for a few months now, and we have more than 1,000 customers already using Arc for server. So this is a pretty mature product now with a lot of different features. What you've probably seen when you tried it a few months back is the ability to connect and get, you know, guest configuration policy and inventory, tagging, RBAC, and so on. Now you can also install extensions on the server so that you can, you know, do monitoring at scale, and you know, run custom script extension, run desired set configuration, all these extensions and capabilities that enable you to manage your VMs. If you go into the Azure portal, you'll see that now on Azure Arc VMs or servers, you can now see update management, change in inventory, all the things that you can see on or most of the things you can see on an Azure VMs, and we continue to work to extend these capabilities as well. Another very important thing to know here is that Azure Monitor is a very special feature where you can say you can log in information from 1,000 different servers into one workspace. And when a user that doesn't have access to the workspace goes and look at the information for servers that he has access to, Azure Monitor knows how to respect the role-based access control and allow the user to see the information for servers that they have access to. And with Azure Arc, the same capabilities apply. So you could have, say, you know, 1,000 servers on-prem, all reporting into the same workspace with Azure Monitor, and the access to this data, when the user goes into the Azure portal and accesses the data in the workspace, would be based on the access to the specific VM. So if I have access to only 10 servers out of the 1,000, I would only be able to see information about these 10 servers. That enables scenarios for DevOps that allow you to, have all the information going to one workspace, with the admin being able to see all the information and DevOps being able to see only the information that pertains to them. A very, very powerful scenario set.
Awesome. I have another question here for Ryan. Do I need an appliance to roll out policies, ARM templates, and so on to my on-premises environments?
Yeah, good question. So Azure Arc enabled servers is agent-based, so we don't require an appliance. All you have to do is install our agent, which is just a couple services or Linux daemons on your machine, and connect it up to Azure with appropriate credentials, and then you'll be good to go. So all you need is an internet connection and our agent.
Awesome. And since we're on servers, Ryan, when I connected an external Linux host to Azure Arc, the only supported distribution was a specific version of Ubuntu. What is the roadmap for additional distributions?
Yeah, good question. So we're right now following the list of Ubuntu and other Linux distros that are supported on Azure VMs, and we're going to follow kind of popularity on user voice as well to determine where we should focus next. So if you have a distribution that you're using that's not currently supported by Azure Arc enabled servers, definitely head on over to the Azure Arc user voice and let us know, and hopefully get some support from the community as well, so we know where to focus our efforts going forward.
Awesome. Jason, one for you on Kubernetes. Azure Arc for Kubernetes has dependencies on Azure CLI, and Azure CLI is not available in Linux ARM64. Is there a workaround on this? They're trying to set up Arc for Kubernetes using Raspberry Pi cluster.
Yeah, that's a great question. And today, so a couple of pieces. Yes, the Azure CLI doesn't support ARM64, and as part of some of the components that we use inside Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, we don't have support for ARM there either. One of those primary components is an open source component called Flux, which is part of our GitOps configuration service. And we've been working with Weaveworks and the community to bring that to ARM64. And once we get all of our dependencies in a row, we'll announce support for the ARM-based architecture. So it is something that we're working on.
Cool. Another question for Ryan. Are you bringing Azure Active Directory managed service identities to on-premises VM via Arc-enabled servers to access past services like Key Vault?
Yeah, good question. So every Azure Arc enabled server will have an AAD managed identity associated with it. So we are bringing, if you're familiar with the Azure Instance Metadata Service, it's a REST API you can query from inside an Azure VM. We have a similar one available on premises that uses the same approach. If you have your own app that you want to go and use that managed identity to talk to other Azure resources, you can go ahead and call that API and get a token from AAD to go and communicate with those services. We don't have any native integrations with Azure Key Vault today, but it is something we're looking into in the future.
And there is a related question to this. Are there any plans to allow the managed identity on Arc-enabled servers to be used for connect AC account identity or authentication to Azure with Azure CLI, and the connect AC account identity is like the command?
Yeah, so this question is really about the built-in Azure PowerShell commandlets being able to use managed identities. It's correct, today it does not understand the Arc managed identity because ours has a slightly different flow of getting access to the token. This is something we'll put on the backlog and take a look at in the future. It's a good call out.
Yeah, I think this is the second time we've heard that. If it's from the same person, that you might want to log into the next session and ask it again. So maybe at some point we'll just get convinced. But if it's not, then we'll definitely have it on the roadmap.
Awesome. One more question around servers. Does Azure Arc enabled servers help with on-premises migrations to Azure and integrations with Azure Migrate?
Yeah, so we don't have any direct integrations with Azure Migrate today, but it is something we're looking into in the future. But the other kind of angle I want to put here is using Azure Arc enabled servers today helps set your IT pros up for using Azure in the future. So if you've got someone who's managing your on-premise state today, moving them into the Azure Arc is going to get them familiar with the Azure portal, the Azure command line tools, the way of managing things in kind of a cloud world. So when you do make that migration in the future into Azure, you'll be much better off and already familiar with the same tools that you'll be using once it becomes an Azure VM, just by using Arc today with it on premises.
Yeah, I would actually like to enhance this answer. As Ryan said, everything he said is correct. But the way I look at this is that you really, once you start managing at scale across your environment, which is what Azure Arc allows you to do, moving to Azure would just continue to be the same management. So you would not need to go and change the way you manage things. You would get obviously much more capabilities that are native in Azure. But the look and feel and the flow would be almost exactly the same. And that is, we believe that this is one of the key scenarios to enable you to manage across your environment so that when you migrate into the cloud, into Azure, you get that same consistent experience and you don't need to go and start changing the way you manage things. So absolutely the right question. And as we move forward, we'll be more and more integrated into with Azure migration. Actually, one of the things that I'm challenging the team to do is to be able to kind of click on an Azure VM, on Azure Arc VM, and just have a command to migrate it. And obviously also at scale we'll be able to migrate these so that the migration will be painless.
Awesome. We have one more question for Ryan on servers. Can I onboard servers into multiple Azure Arc instances?
We might need a little more clarification there, but I'll answer kind of two different interpretations. So each server can be connected to at most one Azure subscription. So the agent, when you go and connect it, you're telling it which subscription and resource group you'll place it into. And we create kind of a projected resource there, which kind of represents your actual server, no matter where it may be running. But you can have, of course, multiple Arc servers per resource group and subscription. And for folks who have multiple tenants, or if you're a managed service provider who might be managing across customers, we are fully integrated with Lighthouse as well. So if you're managing all those Arc servers from different customers, you can do that right through Lighthouse.
Cool. One question around K8s. Does Azure Arc for Kubernetes support Windows Container Host, Jason?
That's a good question. And so our agents today are compiled for Linux, and often, Kubernetes, many of the core components like core DNS require Linux hosts within the cluster for those services to be scheduled. So our agents track that. In terms of being able to deploy and manage workloads and enforce policies in clusters that do have Windows container hosts as part of that cluster, yeah, 100%. Of course, it is up to you as someone who's authoring your Kubernetes manifest to make sure that you do have the appropriate node selectors for platform and OS setup so that those schedule appropriately. But yeah, we could definitely work in a mixed environment.
Yeah, this reminds me also, we did have the Raspberry, going back to the Raspberry Pi question, we did have customers and internal that tried out with Raspberry Pi. What they did is they had a cluster which includes Raspberry Pi and one node that was an x86. So basically they ran the management control plane on the x86 and all the other nodes were Raspberry Pi.
Cool. One other question about servers, Ryan. When will Red Hat Enterprise Linux 8 and CentOS 8 be supported to connected servers?
Yeah, I don't have a firm timeline for when we'll support those. We do have them on our radar. Part of our strategy for releasing support for other OSs and versions of specific OSs is to make sure that all the different components that may integrate with Arc, like the monitoring agents, policy and all that, work extremely well across the board for a particular release. So it's a coordinated effort across multiple teams, but it is on our backlog to add support for those two OSs.
And Ryan, regarding VM extensions, are the Arc-enabled server extensions the same as Azure VM extensions?
Yes, they are. So they are the same VM extensions. You'll see the same version numbers as you would for an Azure VM. They're just being provided through the Arc interface instead of the Azure VM.
Question for you, Tolga. What is the difference between Arc-enabled SQL Server versus Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instances?
So the key difference between the two versions is one is on the evergreen, basically an evergreen solution, meaning you don't have to rely on like a version anymore, and the other one you're still on a version enabled SQL Server. So that's one of the key differences between the two services.
Well, I would say another major key difference is that the SQL Server is running on server.
Yeah, correct.
And you can use the current, like you don't need to go install anything new. Just use your SQL Server, enable, install the Arc and extension, and you're off to the races. And the managed instance is running on a Kubernetes cluster and installed with a full stack of management with it.
Correct.
Another question, how can I connect a server with Azure Arc? Do I need to install anything on the servers? That's for you, Ryan.
Yeah, so the installation process for enabling a server to be onboarded to Arc is you will go to the Azure portal, answer a few questions about where you want that machine to end up, and that will generate an installation script for you. That script will download and install an agent on that machine, so you do need someone or a process with the ability to install that agent, and it will then go and onboard you into Azure. So you will need access that one time, but after you get the agent installed, you can do rest of the management right from the Azure portal.
Yeah, let me add to that one thing that's really important. Today you're managing many different agents. If normal organization manages many agents. So what we are looking to do with Azure Arc is to give you that one agent that you install and then allow you to then manage all other agents as extensions or even as agents that you have through Azure, so that you have that central way to manage all your agents, make sure they're up to date, see their status, troubleshoot them, and so on, versus needing to manage each agent separately. So our goal is that eventually you'll have one agent with a lot of extensions that are managed centrally.
Yeah, that will make it a lot easier, right? Another question regarding servers. Could we Arc enable an Azure VM? What happens if there is a conflict with the already applied, for example, log analytics agent or any other supported agent? Is there a reason to do this?
Yeah, good question. So Arc enabling a machine is really trying to bring that Azure VM experience to things that are not in Azure. So you can't Arc enable an Azure VM because it already has all the same capabilities that we're trying to bring to these on-premises machines. But as far as what happens, for example, if you do have an on-premises server with the log analytics agent installed, you kind of have two options. If you have a very simple configuration of log analytics, you can just deploy the extension right on top of it and replace the configuration. Alternatively, you may choose to just leave it as is, and you'll actually get that benefit that Nir talked about earlier with resource context-based log access. So you get role-based access control into the logs without actually switching to the extension. And then when you're ready, you can go and do that at-scale deployment of the extension on top of all those machines. We'll upgrade the agent and configure it just the way you wanted.
And if you try to install an Arc agent today on a Arc on a server on Azure VM, it would not install. It would roll back and not install.
Makes sense. Another question, can I use Azure Arc with VMware? Could I use data services, Kubernetes, and VMs on VMware? And maybe
absolutely.
Yeah, if you're using like the latest product that came out from VMware was Project Pacific. If you basically have a Kubernetes solution enabled there, then you can technically deploy the data services on top of it. So that's possible. Yes.
On any VM that's running on VMware or physical or virtual, whatever, as long as it runs the OS that we support. Same for Kubernetes cluster, as long as it's a CNCF Kubernetes cluster, no matter where it runs, anywhere, even in AWS and GCP and Google Cloud, you can enable it with Arc, so that you have that really that promise of being able to manage everything in your environment through one single pane of glass.
Awesome. A question for Jason regarding Kubernetes. What distros of Kubernetes can I manage with Azure Arc?
Yeah, that's a good question, and Nir touched on sort of the outline of it. And any CNCF conformant Kubernetes distribution should be able to host and run our Azure Arc agents, or in Kubernetes parlance, it would be an operator. So with pretty broad support, and we definitely want to meet the customers where they are with the Kubernetes clusters that they have. At Build, we also announced some Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes integration partners. So we have folks who like Red Hat OpenShift, Rancher Kubernetes, and Canonical Charmed Kubernetes, who we are working with to make sure that the Azure Arc experience for those Kubernetes distributions is well integrated. And we will be continue to expand that set of partners over time. And we're definitely all ears in terms of user voice for Azure Arc for distribution support that you would like to see referenced there.
And I've seen this question a lot today. Can I use Azure Arc with Azure Lighthouse?
Absolutely. Azure Arc is actually, this is one of the things that's really cool about Azure Arc, that when we built Azure Arc, obviously Azure Arc, what it does, it projects any resource from outside of Azure into the Azure Resource Manager, and Lighthouse just works. We actually wrote 0 lines of code in order to enable Lighthouse. So you can, if you think about, like, let's say you're an MSP, a managed service provider, and you manage, say, 100 VMs for your customer in Azure, and that same customer has, another 1,000 VMs on-prem. Now with Azure Arc, they project it into Azure, and you can manage them all 1,100 the same way using Lighthouse from Azure.
And we are gonna do the last question. What is the recommended way to onboard Arc-enabled servers to Azure Automation state configuration?
Yeah, so when you onboard your machine to Azure Arc-enabled servers, one of the extensions we have available is a DSC extension. That's for both Windows and Linux. So you can actually go and build your meta configuration to go onboard to Azure Automation DSC and provide that to the extension when you go and deploy it. And we will download the meta configuration, apply it to the machine, and it will then start pulling the actual configurations from Azure State Configuration.
Cool. And with that, I think that we are running out of time. I saw another question that I wasn't able to touch base on. Is Azure Arc-enabled servers and Azure Arc-enabled data services in preview? The only announcements are on Azure Arc. These are the 2 core announcements for Azure Arc. Stay tuned, because as new capabilities that the team here is releasing, we will make sure that they're available. Now, for things and resources that you can do to get started with Azure Arc, you can use the Azure Arc Learning Path. We have the link here, aka.ms Azure Arc Learn. You can also learn more about about Azure Arc in our azure.com website, aka.ms Azure Arc Info. In there, you have all the information, including links to all the documentation for Azure Arc as well. We also have a set of skilling videos that are deep dives for the different capabilities, servers, Kubernetes, and data. You can go to Azure Arc skilling videos and find them there. They're hosted on YouTube. And lastly, we put together Azure Infrastructure miniseries. It covers Azure Arc as well, so I highly encourage you to go and check that out as well. And with that, thank you for joining. Thank you for the great questions, and chat soon. Thank you.
Thank you.